The air was cold, the kind of chill that seemed to seep beneath coats and skin, down to the bones. It was April 1775, and a nervous stillness hung over the small village of Lexington, Massachusetts. The wooden homes stood in silence, their windows faintly reflecting the last glow of lanterns snuffed out for the night. Then the sound broke the quiet, the steady tramp of marching boots, distant but drawing nearer, echoing like a drumbeat of fate. Nobody knew yet, but the first shots of revolution were about to be fired, the kind of shots that would ripple far beyond the village green, far beyond the colonies, far beyond even the Atlantic. What force could compel farmers, blacksmiths, and schoolteachers to defy the most powerful empire on earth? And what fire could burn an ordinary heart so bright that it would ignite an entire world?
History remembers it as a clash of ideals, but at that moment it was something more primal. Fear, adrenaline, survival. Imagine standing on the Lexington Green in the darkness, hearing the muffled voices of your neighbors gathering, muskets trembling in their hands. Across the field, the faint red glow of British coats appeared, bayonets glinting in the moonlight. They were not faceless soldiers. They were young men, weary from the march from Boston, driven by duty to crown and command. Yet in that fragile space between darkness and dawn, between loyalty and rebellion, both sides shared the same unease. And then, no one would later agree who fired it first. A single musket cracked through still air. The shot heard round the world.
But how did it come to this? How did a collection of scattered colonies, barely clinging to survival on the edges of a vast wilderness, rise up to challenge the full weight of the British Empire? The story of the American Revolution is not just the tale of battles won and lost. It is a story of ordinary people pulled into extraordinary events, of whispered conspiracies in taverns, of ink-stained parchment carrying words sharper than any sword, of men and women who gambled everything on an idea that no empire could chain. To understand how Lexington led to Yorktown, we must walk through shadowed streets and candlelit rooms, across blood-soaked fields and silent encampment, feeling the breath of history against our skin. Because this was not just a war of muskets and cannons. It was a war of belief, a war for the human spirit.
In the years before Lexington, the American colonies had simmered like a cauldron. Britain's empire stretched across the globe, and its reach into North America was deepening. Taxes, trade restrictions, and the presence of British troops were felt in every port and market square. To some, this was simply the price of empire. To others, it was chains disguised as law. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts, the quartering of troops in colonial homes, each measure tightened the Crown's grip. But the colonists were changing. These were not the fragile settlements of the early 1600s. By the mid-1700s, towns had grown, economies flourished, and a distinctly American spirit had taken root. A spirit restless, questioning, unwilling to be treated as children of a distant king.
Taverns became their forums, pamphlets their weapons, speeches their gunpowder. The names that history would elevate, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, were men who understood the power of words as much as weapons. "Give me liberty or give me death," thundered Henry in Virginia, his voice echoing like a prophecy. Across the colonies, newspapers carried essays that inflamed the imagination. Each shipment of taxed tea, each search by a British customs officer became another spark tossed onto dry tinder. And behind it all, whispers of independence began to creep into conversations. It was still a dangerous word, almost treasonous to speak aloud, but once spoken, it could not be unsaid. Boston was the crucible. Nowhere did the tensions burn hotter. It was here that the Sons of Liberty staged their boldest acts of defiance. The Boston Massacre of 1770 left 5 colonists dead, their blood on the cobblestones, fueling cries of tyranny. 3 years later, disguised as Mohawk Indians, men crept aboard British ships and hurled crates of tea into the harbor. Salt water stained with leaves, the air filled with the scent of rebellion. Britain answered with the coercive acts. The colonists called them the intolerable acts, shutting down Boston's port and tightening control. But instead of breaking the colonies, Britain only bound them together. Outrage spread, committees of correspondence connected towns and provinces, and for the first time, the idea of unity flickered into being. What Britain could not see, or perhaps refused to see, was the strength of that idea. The colonies were scattered across forests, rivers, and mountains, but suddenly they were bound by something more powerful than geography. They began to call themselves not just Virginians or New Englanders or Pennsylvanians, but Americans. And once that word took root, it was unstoppable. The First Continental Congress in 1774 brought delegates from across the colonies to Philadelphia. Men who had never set eyes on each other gathered under one roof, their accents different, their customs varied, but their fears the same. They drafted petitions, called for boycotts, and sent a clear warning across the sea: we will not be slaves. And so the stage was set. By the time dawn broke on Lexington Green, rebellion was no longer a distant whisper, but a living force. The men who faced each other that April morning were not just soldiers and farmers, they were actors in a drama far larger than themselves, a drama that would stretch from the rolling hills of New England to the swamps of the Carolinas, from the frozen banks of the Delaware River to the tobacco fields of Virginia. What began as a skirmish in a quiet village would spiral into a war that no one could have predicted and few could even comprehend. Yet at its heart lay the simplest of questions. How far would people go for freedom? The news of Lexington and Concord traveled like wildfire, carried on horseback through towns and villages, whispered in churches and taverns, and scrawled hastily in letters passed from hand to hand. In a world without telegrams or newspapers hot off the press, rumor moved with the speed of fear, and soon the story of the first shots spread across the colonies. Some said the British fired first, others swore the colonists had provoked them. It didn't matter. What mattered was that blood had been spilled, and once that barrier was broken, there was no going back. Mothers clutched their children tighter, farmers checked the flints of their muskets, and across 13 colonies, men began to prepare themselves for a war that few had truly believed would come. The British commanders in Boston had underestimated the colonists. They had believed them weak, divided, incapable of serious resistance. But Concord had proven otherwise. When the British soldiers marched back to Boston, they did so under relentless fire from behind stone walls, trees, and fences. Farmers had become marksmen. Hunters had become soldiers. By the time the Redcoats staggered back onto Boston, nearly 300 of their number had been killed or wounded. The message was clear. The colonies would not bow easily. And soon, thousands of militiamen gathered outside Boston, forming a ragtag siege. An empire's soldiers were trapped inside a city they had once controlled with ease. In the weeks that followed, the tension escalated further. Colonists built makeshift fortifications on the surrounding hills, determined to keep the British pen inside Boston. It was a strange war at first, not quite open conflict, not quite peace. Skirmishes flared, but there was still hope, at least in London, that the unrest could be crushed quickly. Then came June, and with it, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Colonists dug into the slopes of Breed's Hill, overlooking the city.
When the British charged, their red lines advancing uphill, the colonists held their fire until the enemy was close enough to see the whites of their eyes. Twice, the British were thrown back. Only on the third assault, when the colonists' powder ran out, did the hill fall. Technically, it was a British victory, but the staggering losses, over 1,000 men, shocked the Empire. If this was victory, how would defeat look?
By now, there was no turning back. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia and made a decision that changed history. George Washington, a tall Virginian planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, was chosen to lead the Continental Army. He arrived at camp outside Boston in July, riding on horseback through cheering crowds. Yet the reality he faced was grim. His army was an undisciplined collection of farmers, hunters, and tradesmen, poorly supplied and prone to desertion. They lacked uniforms, weapons, even shoes. Washington's task was monumental: transform this chaos into a fighting force that could withstand the might of Britain.
While Washington drilled his troops, the war spread beyond Boston. British warships prowled the coast, their sails black against the horizon, blockading harbors and cutting off supplies. In the South, Loyalists clashed with Patriots in bitter skirmishes, while in Canada, an American invasion faltered in the frozen winter at Quebec. Each colony became a battleground, not only between armies, but between neighbors. Families were torn apart. A father might side with the crown while his son marched with the rebels. Brothers fought on opposite sides, each convinced of his righteousness. This was not only a war against Britain, it was a civil war within America itself.
The true turning point came not on the battlefield, but with words. In January 1776, a pamphlet appeared that would change everything: Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Written in plain, direct language, it called not for reconciliation, but for independence. Paine's words cut through fear and hesitation, igniting imaginations across the colonies. A government of our own is our natural right, he declared. In taverns, workshops, and homes, people read it aloud, nodding with conviction. What had once been treasonous to say was now on every tongue: America must break free. By July, the momentum was unstoppable. Delegates in Philadelphia debated furiously, but the tide of history pushed them forward. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Its words, penned by Thomas Jefferson and revised by his fellow delegates, rang with immortal clarity. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. For the first time, the colonies declared themselves united as free states. Church bells rang out, crowds gathered, and soldiers listened as the declaration was read aloud in camps. Yet joy was tempered by dread. Independence meant open defiance. There was no retreat, no compromise. It was now freedom or death.
Britain answered swiftly. That summer, the largest expeditionary force it had ever assembled crossed the Atlantic. Dozens of warships, their sails blotting the horizon, anchored off New York Harbor. On board were tens of thousands of soldiers, including elite Hessian mercenaries hired from Germany. The message was unmistakable. The Empire would crush this rebellion with overwhelming force. Washington positioned his army on Long Island, but when the British attacked in August, the colonists were outflanked and routed. Under cover of night and fog, Washington led a desperate retreat across the East River, saving his army from annihilation. To many, it seemed the revolution might be over before it had truly begun.
The months that followed were bleak. Washington's army was driven across New Jersey, pursued relentlessly. Soldiers deserted, supplies dwindled, morale collapsed. By December, only a few thousand ragged men remained with him. They had no shoes, their feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. Across the colonies, whispers of despair grew louder. Was this bold experiment already doomed? Had the dream of independence died in its cradle? Yet in the darkest moment, Washington made his boldest move. On Christmas night, 1776, he led his men across the icy Delaware River, surprising the Hessians at Trenton the next morning. It was a small victory, but its effect was electric. Hope returned, and with it, belief.
That winter at Morristown, then later at Valley Forge, Washington's army endured hunger, disease, and bitter cold. Men huddled in wooden huts, their breath visible in the frigid air, their bodies wrapped in rags. Yet, amidst the suffering, a transformation took place. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, drilled the men with ruthless precision, teaching them the discipline of European armies. By spring, the Continental Army was no longer a mob of farmers, but a trained, hardened force. The revolution was not merely surviving, it was evolving. What followed in the years after Valley Forge was less a straight march to victory than a long descent into the unknown. The revolution seemed caught between survival and collapse, a fragile experiment balanced on a knife's edge. Britain still held New York, its armies were supplied and disciplined, its navy ruled the seas. By all logic, the rebellion should have failed. And yet, the colonists endured. The central mystery of the revolution was not simply how battles were won or lost, but how hope itself survived. Every fact said they could not triumph, yet somewhere in the smoke of muskets and the scratch of quills and ragged camps and desperate councils, something invisible kept driving them forward.
For Washington, the mystery was daily survival. He faced shortages that no British general ever imagined. Gunpowder so scarce that each shot was counted, shoes worn until feet bled, coats patched until they dissolved. And yet his army remained. Why did men who had nothing stay when desertion was easier, when farms and families called them home? Some said it was loyalty to Washington himself, whose presence radiated a calm dignity, even in disaster. Others said it was belief, not in certain victory, but in the idea that their struggle might mean something greater than themselves. Whatever the reason, the army that should have dissolved instead grew harder, more determined.
The British, meanwhile, were confident that time would crush the rebellion. In 1777, General Burgoyne marched south from Canada with a grand plan to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. His army of redcoats, loyalists, and native allies was disciplined and strong. Yet in the tangled forests of upstate New York, he found himself harassed by militia, slowed by destroyed bridges, and exhausted by endless wilderness. At Saratoga, American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold surrounded him. In October, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. It was more than a battlefield victory. It was the first proof to the world that the Americans could stand against Britain.
This victory unlocked a secret that had been waiting overseas. France, Britain's old rival, had watched the rebellion carefully. Until Saratoga, they doubted it would survive. But now, Paris buzzed with possibility. By early 1778, the French formally allied with the Americans, sending fleets and armies across the ocean. For the first time, Britain faced not just rebellious colonies, but a global war. Spain and the Dutch Republic soon followed, each eager to strike at the empire. The mystery deepened. Was this truly the colonists' revolution, or a spark that had set the world aflame?
Still, the road ahead was brutal. In the South, Britain shifted its strategy, unleashing campaigns of fire and devastation. Cities like Savannah and Charleston fell. Loyalist militias hunted their patriot neighbors, and the war grew savage. In swamps and forests, men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, waged guerrilla warfare, striking then vanishing into the marshes. This was no longer the elegant war of lines and muskets. It was a shadow war, dirty, personal, and relentless. And through it all, the question loomed: how much suffering could a people endure before they broke?
The revolution's mystery was also one of betrayal. Benedict Arnold, the same man who had fought with brilliance at Saratoga, turned traitor. Bitter over slights and debts, he plotted to hand the fort at West Point to the British. His treason was discovered, but the shock reverberated through the colonies. If one of the brightest generals could betray them, what hope remained? And yet, Arnold's name became a curse, and strangely, his treachery strengthened the cause. Americans swore that if they could not trust individuals, they would trust the greater dream. Out of betrayal came resolve.
What kept the revolution alive was a strange mix of chance, endurance, and something almost beyond explanation. Time and again, Washington escaped destruction by the slimmest of margins. Fog covering his retreat from New York, storms scattering British fleets, spies in the right place at the right time. Some whispered providence, others mere luck. But whatever it was, it created an aura that Washington himself seemed to embody. The sense that even in defeat, he remained unbroken. His presence was the revolution's greatest mystery, a man who lost more battles than he won, yet never lost the war.
By 1780, the revolution had dragged on for 5 years, bleeding the colonies white. Farms lay ruined, cities burned, thousands dead. And yet, the army still marched. Ordinary men who might have lived quiet lives as farmers, cobblers, or blacksmiths instead endured hunger, marched barefoot, and faced musket fire. What mystery bound them to this cause? Was it hatred of tyranny, loyalty to comrades, or simply the refusal to admit defeat? Each man had his reason, but together they formed something greater, an idea that outlived them all.
And in the midst of it all, whispers grew. Could they truly win? Could this fragile rebellion, starved of coin and rations, rise to overthrow a crown whose reach spanned continents? To the outside world, it seemed impossible. To the soldiers trudging through mud, it seemed barely conceivable. Yet, every winter endured, every battle fought, every loss survived, that added weight to the unthinkable. That the impossible might become inevitable. The mystery was no longer whether they could resist, but whether they might actually prevail.
When historians look back on the Revolution, they often ask the same haunting question that contemporaries once whispered. Why did the colonies win? The evidence at first glance points toward impossibility. Britain commanded the largest navy in the world, a professional army hardened by decades of European wars, and an empire that stretched from India to the Caribbean. The colonies had no standing army, no navy, and no unified government. Logic insists that the rebellion should have been crushed, and yet the rebellion survived, and then triumphed. To explain this, we must gather the evidence like detectives reconstructing a crime scene, sifting through the fragments of battles, alliances, and human will.
The first piece of evidence lies in geography. America was vast, wild, and untamed. For every city Britain occupied, there stretched 1,000 miles of forest, rivers, and mountains impossible to hold. The empire's armies marched down narrow roads lined with hostile farms. Their supply lands were vulnerable to ambushes. Every hill could hide a rifleman, every swamp a militia band. Even when Britain seized strongholds like New York or Charleston, the land beyond remained restless, unconquerable. The colonies did not need to defeat the empire outright, they needed only to outlast it. Geography itself became a weapon, one that no musket could silence.
The second piece of evidence is leadership. Washington, though far from flawless, possessed a rare quality that eluded British generals: patience. He understood that the revolution could not be won by one decisive battle. Instead, he wove a strategy of survival. Retreat when necessary and carefully chosen strikes. Time and again he resisted the temptation to gamble everything on glory, instead conserving his fragile army. His genius was not in brilliant victories, but in knowing when not to lose. His presence alone, calm amidst chaos, bound the army together. The British called him elusive. His men called him indispensable. The third lies in ideology. Unlike Britain's soldiers, many of whom fought for pay or under orders, the communists fought for belief. Not all believed equally, not all cared for abstract liberty, but enough were willing to endure hunger, wounds, and death because they felt the cause mattered. Farmers left their plows, blacksmiths their forges, merchants their shops, each risking everything, not for empire, but for the hope of freedom. This belief was contagious, spreading in sermons, pamphlets, and songs. An army that should have dissolved instead hardened, because the men who filled its ranks believed they were writing a story greater than themselves.
Yet belief alone cannot explain musket fire. Another crucial piece of evidence was foreign aid. France's entry into the war transformed it from a colonial uprising into a global conflict. French ships contested Britain's mastery of the seas, French gold supplied American armies, and French troops marched on American soil. Spain harassed British holdings in the Gulf, and Dutch traders funneled weapons to the rebels. Without this foreign lifeline, the revolution might have starved. But why did France risk so much? Theories abound. Some say it was revenge for losses in the 7 Years' War. Others that enlightened ideals inspired French elites. Whatever the reason, the alliance was the hinge upon which the revolution turned. It does for the rest that many point to the experience of the Continental.
Still, the revolution's survival also depended on Britain's mistakes. Their commanders, accustomed to European battlefields, underestimated the colonists' adaptability. They seized cities but failed to pacify the countryside. They expected loyalist support that rarely materialized in force. At times, they split their armies across vast distances, exposing them to isolation and defeat. Historians debate whether arrogance or flawed intelligence guided these errors, but each one gave the colonists breathing room. Theories suggest Britain's hubris was its undoing, that it fought not against armies, but against an idea it could never truly grasp. Then there is the evidence of resilience at the ground level. Civilians bore the weight of war as much as soldiers. Women managed farms, ran shops, and even carried water and ammunition into battle. Children tended fields. Elders passed intelligence along shadowed roads. Each act, however small, fed the cause. Was this a revolution of generals and declarations, or of countless invisible hands sustaining it? Some argue that the true mystery lie not in victories like Saratoga or Yorktown, but in the daily endurance of ordinary people who refused to quit, even when the world seemed to collapse around them.
Of course, not all evidence paints the revolution in heroic light. Loyalists, a large minority, faced persecution, their homes burned, their voices silenced. Enslaved people heard promises of freedom from both British and American sides, yet most remained in bondage after the war. Native nations were split, some siding with Britain, others with America, many suffering betrayal either way. Was the revolution truly fought for liberty, or for the liberty of a few? Historians argue endlessly, suggesting that the mystery of American freedom lies in contradictions. A war for independence that did not grant independence to all.
Theories multiply when considering chance. What if Washington had been captured in New York? What if France had hesitated after Saratoga? What if Arnold's treachery had succeeded at West Point? Each possibility reveals how fragile the revolution truly was, how close it came to annihilation. Some argue that victory was inevitable once France joined. Others believe it was a miracle of timing, 1,000 accidents aligning. The evidence is inconclusive, but perhaps the truth lies in the interplay of design and accident. Strategy held the line, while fortune tipped the scales.
And in the end, one cannot ignore the symbolic weight of the revolution. Even when victories were few, the image of resistance inspired allies abroad and drew recruits at home. Every story of ragged men holding against redcoats, every tale of Washington's calm in disaster, built a mythology that was as powerful as gunpowder. Was it propaganda, or was it faith? Perhaps both. The evidence suggests that humans are not moved by facts alone, but by stories. And the revolution was a story being written in real time, a story too compelling to let die.
Thus, the mystery remains. Was the revolution won by strategy, geography, alliances, mistakes, or sheer endurance? The evidence points to all, yet none explain fully. Each fact, each theory, each fragment of history adds weight to the question, but never settles it. Perhaps the revolution endured not because it should have, but because it had to. Perhaps some stories are too potent to be extinguished, even by empires.
By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 relentless years. America was exhausted. Farms lay in ruins, treasuries were empty, and families were broken by loss and division. Washington's army, though seasoned, was still fragile, still clothed in rags and fed by scraps. Britain, too, was bleeding, stretched thin across the globe, fighting not only in America but in the Caribbean, India, and on the seas. Both sides longed for an end, but neither could yield. And then, like a tide pulling silently beneath the surface, fate began to converge on a small Virginia town, Yorktown.
The British commander in the South, General Cornwallis, had marched his troops across the Carolinas, battling patriots and chasing shadows. By autumn, he dug in at Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the York River. His plan was simple: fortify the town, wait for reinforcements from the British Navy, and crush the rebellion in the South. But what Cornwallis did not know was that the noose was already tightening around him, woven not only by American determination, but by French cunning.
For years, Washington had dreamed of striking New York, but when news arrived that the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing toward the Chesapeake Bay, he saw his chance. In secrecy, he marched his army south from New York, uniting with French forces under Rochambeau. It was a daring gamble, an army of thousands moving hundreds of miles, hoping to trap Cornwallis before the British Navy could intervene. Along the roads, villagers watched with astonishment as blue-coated French veterans marched beside ragged American soldiers, 2 worlds colliding, united by purpose.
The march south was itself a masterpiece of deception. Washington spread rumors that he still planned to attack New York, fooling British spies into complacency. By the time the truth emerged, it was too late. Cornwallis was trapped between Washington's advancing army and the French fleet sealing off the Chesapeake. When the Allies reached Yorktown in late September, they found the British dug in behind earthworks in trenches. The siege had begun.
For weeks, the air around Yorktown thundered with cannon fire. Day and night, American and French artillery pounded British defenses, shattering walls, splintering houses, and filling the sky with smoke. Soldiers dug trenches under enemy fire, crawling forward yard by yard. The roar was unceasing, a storm of iron and fire. Inside the town, civilians cowered in cellars, soldiers patched wounds, and Cornwallis waited for a relief fleet that never came. Each day, the ring grew tighter.
The climax came with the assault on the British redoubts. Two strong points guarded Cornwallis's lines, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10. If they fell, the siege would be unbreakable. On the night of October 14, 1781, the order came. French troops stormed Redoubt 9, while Americans under Alexander Hamilton charged Redoubt 10. In the darkness, they advanced with bayonets fixed, muskets unloaded to maintain silence. Then, with a sudden cry, they rushed forward. British defenders fired desperately, but the attackers poured over the walls in a furious melee of steel and smoke. Within minutes, both redoubts were taken. The noose was drawn tight.
Cornwallis knew the end had come. Trapped, his defenses shattered, his men exhausted, he attempted one last, desperate escape across the York River, but storms scattered his boats. There would be no deliverance. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. Thousands of redcoats marched out, their drums muffled, their flags furled. American and French troops stood in solemn silence, watching an empire's pride collapse. Washington, dignified and composed, refused to meet Cornwallis personally. The British general sent an aide in his place. The war was not officially over, but Yorktown was its breaking point. The empire had been humbled, and the world would never be the same.
And yet, even in victory, the mystery lingered. How had a ragged army of farmers, merchants, and dreamers cornered the greatest power of the age? How had Washington, so often beaten in battle, engineered this final triumph? Some point to French fleets, others to Cornwallis's errors, others still to the unbreakable resolve of the Americans themselves. But the truth is tangled, as history always is. Yorktown was not a single miracle, but the culmination of countless threads: strategy, chance, endurance, betrayal, and belief, all woven into one climactic moment.
For Washington, the moment was bittersweet. He knew the war was not fully over. Britain still had armies in New York and Charleston. But he also knew the tide had turned irreversibly. As his soldiers cheered, he remained reserved, his face lined with exhaustion. He had carried the revolution through despair, defeat, and near collapse to this high point. But even then, he seemed to understand that the true battle lay ahead, not just to win independence, but to survive it.
The fields of Yorktown were littered with the wreckage of empire, broken cannons, scattered drums, and the silence of surrender. For days afterward, smoke drifted in the air, carrying the acrid sting of gunpowder and fire. Soldiers who had faced each other with steel and fury now stood awkwardly in truce, exchanging weary glances across the same fields they had bled upon. The revolution had reached its crescendo, but in the stillness that followed, a question hung heavy in the air. Was this truly the end, or only another beginning?
Word of Yorktown traveled faster than any courier could carry. From Virginia's farms to Boston's docks, from the swamps of the Carolinas to the streets of Philadelphia, bells rang and crowds wept with joy. Newspapers printed bold headlines: victory, liberty, independence. But beneath the celebrations ran a quieter current of unease. Britain had not yet signed peace. The king still held armies in New York and Charleston. His navy prowled the seas. Everyone knew that one battle, however decisive, did not end an empire's war. And so,
America celebrated, but cautiously, as though afraid that too much joy might shatter the fragile spell of triumphing.
Washington himself refused to indulge in euphoria. His soldiers cheered, sang, and toasted the victory, but he remained watchful. He knew the war had been long and cruel, and peace could still dissolve into chaos. He wrote to Congress not in triumph, but in warning. Supplies were exhausted, men were restless, and discipline fragile. If Britain struck again, the revolution could yet falter. His stoic calm at Yorktown had not been relief, but vigilance, for he understood that winning independence was one thing, surviving it another.
Months stretched into years. Negotiations dragged on across the Atlantic, in drawing rooms thick with tobacco smoke and whispered bargains. Diplomats argued over borders, debts, fishing rights, and the fate of loyalists. Meanwhile, in America, uncertainty festered. Soldiers demanded back pay they might never see. Farmers, taxed to fund the war, grumbled against their new governments. Merchants worried that the fragile economy would collapse without British trade. Even as independence seemed secured, unrest bubbled beneath the surface. The revolution had toppled one order, but what would rise in its place?
In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized American independence, ceding vast lands stretching to the Mississippi River. The news reached America with a shock of finality. At last, it was official. The colonies were now a nation. Yet the moment of triumph was strangely subdued. Washington, in his headquarters at Newburgh, read the news in silence, then walked outside to gaze across the Hudson River. The dream had been achieved, and yet he knew dreams could turn into nightmares if not carefully guarded.
When Washington resigned his commission before Congress in December of that year, the room fell into hushed awe. Here was a man who could have seized power, crowned himself king of the newborn nation, but instead, he laid down authority and returned to his farm. It was an act almost unheard of in history, a gesture that carried as much weight as Yorktown itself. Yet, the silence that followed his words was not simply reverence, it was also fear. If not Washington, who would guide this fragile republic through storms ahead? The revolution had ended, but the struggle was not over. Loyalists fled by the thousands, their property seized, their names cursed. Native nations, abandoned by both Britain and America, faced waves of settlers pressing westward. Enslaved men and women who had fought for promises of freedom found themselves once again in chains, betrayed by both sides. The revolution had promised liberty, but its meaning was already fractured, contested, incomplete. Was this the dawn of freedom, or merely a new empire in disguise? The tension lingered, a shadow cast across the fresh horizon of independence. In taverns and parlors, people whispered uneasily. The war was over, but what bound 13 fractious states together? The Articles of Confederation, weak and faltering, threatened to let the new nation crumble before it had even begun. Some wondered if the revolution had simply traded one master for 13. The haunting truth was that independence had not solved the mystery. It had only deepened it. Could liberty endure without unity? Could a dream survive when tested by hunger, greed, and ambition? The guns of Yorktown had fallen silent, but the echoes of those questions would thunder for generations.
And so, the revolution closed not with a clean resolution, but with unresolved tension. The empire had been defeated, yet the new nation stood unsteady, trembling like a newborn in a dangerous world. The mystery was never simply how America won, but whether America could endure.
That question lingered in every farmhouse, every port, every distant frontier settlement. It lingered in Washington's quiet eyes as he rode home to Mount Vernon, in the whispers of freedmen still in bondage, in the ink of laws that would soon divide as much as unite. History calls it a victory, but victory is never the end of the story. The fields are quiet now. The thunder of cannons has faded, the smoke has long since drifted away, and the voices of those who lived it echo only faintly in the wind. But if you listen closely, if you stand on the green of Lexington, the banks of the Delaware, or the scarred earth of Yorktown, you can still feel it, a pulse beneath the soil, the memory of a time when ordinary men and women stepped into history and altered its course forever. The revolution was not clean, nor simple, nor resolved. It was blood and fire, betrayal and hope, triumph and contradiction all at once, and yet, from its chaos, a new world emerged.
The mystery endures because the revolution itself was unfinished. Liberty was declared, but not for all. Unity was proclaimed, but constantly threatened. What began in defiance of empire became a story of survival, of building, of striving toward an ideal that was always just out of reach. Perhaps that is why it still grips us, because the revolution was never a closed chapter, but a question passed down like a torch. What does freedom mean? What price is it worth? Who is it for? These questions, born on the wind of musket smoke, have never stopped burning.
And so we return to where it began, on a quiet green in Massachusetts, where a single shot shattered the silence of empire. No one knows who fired it. No one knows if it was accident or intention, but we know what followed. The world was changed forever. From Lexington to Yorktown, from despair to triumph, from whispers of liberty to the thunder of independence, the revolution was a journey of impossible odds. And yet, impossibility became reality. That is its power, its warning, its gift. Perhaps that is why the story lingers in our veins even now. It reminds us that empires are not eternal, that ideas can outlast armies, and that the smallest spark can ignite a fire that consumes the world. It reminds us, too, of the fragility of it all, how close it came to failing, how easily it could have been lost. The revolution is not just the past. It is a mirror, one that asks us what we will do when history calls again. And so the story rests now in your hands, in your thoughts, in your voice. You have walked through the smoke and silence, felt the hunger and hope, seen the rise from Lexington's fear to Yorktown's surrender. What does it leave you with? Does it leave you with pride, with unease, with wonder? The revolution does not end on the battlefield. It ends in the minds of those who remember, those who carry its questions forward. If this story stirred something within you, if it made you feel the chill of that April dawn or the roar of that October night, then carry it onward. Speak of it, question it, share it. Let others step into the silence of Lexington and hear the shot that still echoes. Let them march with Washington through the snow, storm the redoubts at Yorktown, and wonder how freedom was ever won at all. For history only lives when it is remembered, and its mysteries only endure when we keep them alive. And now the question comes to you. What do you believe carried the revolution to its end? Was it strategy, luck, endurance, or something deeper, a force that defies explanation?
The answer may never be known, but in searching for it, we keep alive the very spirit that made the impossible possible. Share your thoughts. Share your voice. For the revolution story does not belong only to the past. It belongs to all who dare to ask, what would we fight for if our time came?